Welcome. We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and this is part 2 of the history of the Assyrian peoples and the turmoil that they've been put through, that they experienced throughout many centuries. This is part 2, the Assyrian Church of the East and their history. The Assyrian Church of the East in India is known as the Chaldean Syrian Church. Outside India, the name Chaldean Church refers to that branch of the Church of the East which has a separate existence from 1553 AD. The Chaldean Syrian Church in India is based in Churkur, headed by His Grace Dr. Ma Aprim. From the arrival of St. Thomas till the Cunene cross in 1653, the history of the Indian Church is common. Between the 3rd and the 9th centuries there were waves of immigrants from Mesopotamia to Kerala and from the early centuries. This church, with its liturgical centre in Edessa, formerly known as Urhai or Urhai, had also claimed its origin from St. Thomas. Thus the East Syrian or Chaldean liturgy was used in Kerala until the 17th century. The Syrian Church, using the Syriac liturgy in Kerala, was undivided until the advent of the Portuguese. The Portuguese set up their headquarters in Goa early in the 16th century and extended their domain to Kerala. The Archbishop of Goa, backed by the Portuguese, claimed jurisdiction over the Syrian Christians of Malabar. The East Syrian liturgy and the Mesopotamian connection of the St. Thomas Christians laid them open to suspicion of Nestorianism. Nestorius was well known for going up against another bishop, possibly of the Roman Catholic Church, who wanted to be the bishop of bishops, and Nestorius claimed or stated that Yeshua Mashiach, or Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, was both divine and human. Hypostasis, he was of two substances, two natures. So this jealous opponent started to tell lies and calling him a heretic, etc., etc. Years or centuries later, the Church of the East said, well, he's correct. We've actually believed what he stated, the hypostasis, that Jesus is of two substances, both divine and human, is of two natures, thousands of years before he did. So they were labelled heretics and so forth, and then from there persecuted, erroneously stated as a church founded by the man Nestorius, etc., etc. Faithful persecution through the Roman Catholic Church, Emperor Constantine, the Roman Catholic Church, Genghis Khan and the Mongols, Tamerlane, the Mohammedans under different caliphates, and the Kurds, and this century ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc. And the Kurds, who basically said to these extremists, these terrorist faction, okay, this is where these people live, so they went and persecuted them apparently. This is according to the personal research we've done on this subject, the Assyrians in their particular country. Okay, from the arrival of St. Thomas to the Cunene cross of 1653, the history of the Indian Church is common. Between the 3rd and the 9th centuries there were waves of immigrants from Mesopotamia to Kerala, and from the early centuries this church was, with its liturgical centre in Edessa, had also claimed its origin from St. Thomas. Thus the East Syrian or Chaldean liturgy was used in Kerala until the 17th century. The Syrian Church, using the Syriac liturgy in Kerala, was undivided until the advent of the Portuguese. The Portuguese set up their headquarters in Goa early in the 16th century and extended their domain to Kerala. The Archbishop of Goa, backed by the Portuguese, claimed jurisdiction over the Syrian Christians of Malabar. The East Syrian liturgy and the Mesopotamian connection of the St. Thomas Christians laid them open to suspicion of Nestorianism, and Archbishop Menezes of Goa, who arrived in Kerala in December 1598, was determined to bring them into the Latin way of worship. He convened, so he's trying to get them into the Roman Catholic Church and their doctrines, their dogmas. He convened a synod at Addai in June 1599. Many decrees of the synod were aimed at bringing the Syrian liturgy and practices into conformity with those of the Latin Rite. After the revolt of Cuneian Cross in 1653 AD, some Syrian Christians of Malabar accepted Mar Gregorius Abdul Jalil of Jerusalem, who arrived in Kerala in a Dutch ship in 1665. He belonged to the West Syrian Church. The Syrian Christians who took the Cuneian Cross oath accepted it. Thus a large section of the Syrian Christians of Kerala became a West Syrian Church known as the Syrian Orthodox Church. The St. James liturgy used by the Syrian Orthodox Church replaced the liturgy of the Apostles, Addai and Mari. The Syrian Christians around Angamali who did not accept Mar Gregorius waited for East Syrian bishops as before. Mar Gabriel came in 1701. He died in Kerala in 1731 and was buried in Chirapalli in Kottayam, which is under the control of the Indian Orthodox Syrian Church. The present Metropolitan Mar Aprem, born in 1940, completed 70 years of age on 13th of June 2010. His first doctorate thesis was a study of the history, faith and worship of the Chaldean Syrian Church in Trikur since 1814 AD. The University of Serampore, India, awarded D.Th, must be Doctor of Theology degree in 1976. He was awarded that. The second doctorate for the PhD of Mahatma Gandhi University was the history of the Assyrian Church of the East in the 20th century, with special reference to the Syriac literature in Kerala. The Holy Apostolic Catholic Assyrian Church of the East, an ennobled nation of India by the grace of God Almighty, or Almighty God, had been witnessed and blessed by the historic third patriarchal visit of His Holiness Maran Mardinka IV, the Catholicos Patriarch, along with other 8 prelates of the Church of the East from across the world, in order to convene the Holy Synod and holy consecration of 2 bishops in India. Both the Holy Synod and bishop consecration for the first time in the history of the Church of the East in the Indian soil. The Holy Synod was convened from 13th to 19th January 2010 at the Metropolitan's Palace. Thrissur, the cultural capital of Kerala, is popularly called God's own country. Popularly called God's own country, the southern state of India. By divine will and unconditional grace, His Holiness Maran Mardinka IV, the Catholicos Patriarch of the Church of the East, consecrated the 2 archdeacons as episcopes bishops on Sunday 17 January 2010, and thus the country India witnessed one more historical event. Archdeacon Joju Anto received the name. Mar Yohanan Joseph Episcopa and Archdeacon Shaju Polosi named Mar Organ Kuriakos Episcopa. The Church of the Eastern India is using the liturgy of Addai and Mari. There are 2 alternate anaphoras. Counting the Addai and Mari as the first anaphora, the second is known as that of Theodore of Mopsuestia. He died 428. This is used on Sundays from the Advent season until after the Psalm Sunday. Theodore of Mopsuestia, the interpreter, wrote this anaphora. This anaphora was translated from the Greek into Syriac by Mar Awa Catholicos on the occasion of his visit to the Roman Empire by the help of Mar Thoma, the teacher of Urhai. Is that Thomas, the Master Thomas? I'm not too sure on that one. From the Holy Saturday until the beginning of Advent, the first anaphora of Addai and Mari is used. The third anaphora is that of Nestorius. This is slightly longer than the first 2 anaphora. This third anaphora is used on 5 occasions, named Epiphany, Memorial of Mar Yohanan Mamdhana, Memorial of Greek Malpins, the Wednesday of the Ba'utha of the Nivanites, and Maundy Thursday. The liturgy has been translated into Malayalam. Most portions of liturgy are used in the Malayalam translation for the benefit of the worshippers. However, most of the priests recite some prayers in the original Aramaic language. The text of the liturgy is printed with 2 languages. And here there's supposed to be some list of interviews and performances. Aramaic Project Part 2 and 3. So we will look at that soon, if there's more to it. But we would like to present you with this audio, The Heroes of the Faith, the Church of the East, and this was found in the public domain, public access. So here is the icons, non-commercial, okay, and these have the different meanings, so it's free for people to use for their social media, YouTube channel, etc. As long as you're not making money or claiming that it's yours, etc. It's a sermon lecture given at Second Baptist Church of Calais, Maine. So we shouldn't get ourselves a copyright claim or a strike in regards to this audio that we found in the domain in the public access. So let's have a listen to that. It's about 41 minutes long.
Which is in East Syria. During Jesus' lifetime, he heard about Jesus. And he suffered from a chronic condition, and so he wrote a letter to Jesus saying,
I know why it started there.
I believe in you. Would you please come up here and heal me of this illness? And he was...
Okay, we don't know why it started way back there. When we put it back there. Okay, it's the very beginning.
Who take the gospel to India. It's a marvelous story. We don't know 100%.
Okay, problems with this thing.
It's true. Most of these stories
from... We're going to go back as far as we can. Excuse us, but this thing decided not to play where we set it to.
And it's hard to encompass an entire church tradition throughout 20 centuries of history in just 2 pages, so tonight you get 4. I'm hoping this will prove very interesting, because for me as a student of history, I didn't know about the Church of the East for a long time. I grew up in church history classes, and sort of the accepted narrative was that the faith started in Palestine, and then the Apostle Paul took it into Turkey and Greece, and then ultimately it took it to Rome. From Rome it spread up into Europe, and Christianity was the faith of Europe through the Middle Ages. And then after the Middle Ages, finally Catholics and Protestants started sending out missionaries between 1500 and 1800 all over the world, finally evangelizing a lot of those places that had never received the gospel before. My discovery of the Church of the East has sort of reversed a lot of that thinking. This is the story of a church that managed to evangelize vast tracts of Asia, China, India, Mongolia, places that our tradition of faith didn't send missionaries to until the 1800s. These guys were there by the year 500 to 600 AD, spreading the gospel beyond the bounds of their own countries, sending out missionaries and evangelizing the world. A marvelous tradition of faith. The other thing that I hope we're going to get out of it, beyond just encouragement for missionary zeal, is to think deeply about what's happening happening today in the Middle East, what it means for us as Christians to be part of America with our involvement as a country in the Middle East, and part of the church with the church's involvement in the Middle East, and how those two things go together, or how sometimes they actually produce friction with one another. I think the story of this church will also give us a little bit of insight into some of our own fears about the future of our country, what will happen to the Christian faith in the USA. A lot of us have seen changes on that mark in our own lifetimes, and I think a lot of us worry about that. The Church of the East is going to speak to that, although maybe not in the most optimistic way you might hope. But we'll get to that eventually. Let me look at our theme scriptures for tonight. The first one I've already read. That's the story from Matthew chapter 2, where Persian believers pop up for the very first time, really before any other nationality. The Magi come from the east to worship the baby Jesus. And then...
So is someone stated on something we're looking at, they were Indians? No, they were Persians. They didn't come from India, they were Persians.
This verse from Mark 13. You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. These two verses here sum up together a lot of the story of the Church of the East. It's a story of persecution on the one hand and missions on the other. The Church of the East suffered persecution unlike anything that almost any other church in history has faced. But at the same time, they also became the most powerful missionary force in Christianity for the first 1,000 years, and won a lot of people to Christ. So the two standout figures from this church that I've chosen to talk about are Babai the Great and Timothy the Great. The picture there you get is of Babai. Now if you're unhappy with the picture that ended up in our photo directory of you, just be glad you didn't end up like Babai. I mean, this is the only picture we have of him, and he's like half skeletal, standing in a dress that looks like it's made out of rocks. With that beard, he could be a member of the Boston Red Sox, couldn't he? So that's Babai the Great. We don't actually even have a picture of Timothy the Great, or at least I couldn't find him. But let me just introduce these two guys, and then I'll back up and tell the story of the church in this geographical area. So Babai the Great was a prominent theologian and an instrumental leader of the Church of the East during the final years of the Sassanid Persian Empire. His writings clarified the theology of the Eastern Church, and his efforts kept the church strong in an era when it was suffering renewed persecution. And then Timothy the Great, who reigned as patriarch from 780 to 823, guided the Church of the East during its golden age. Leading from his church in Baghdad, Timothy held debates with the Muslim Caliph, organized a program of scholarly translation which gave the Arab world the resources of classical science and philosophy, and encouraged the missionary expansion of the church further into India, Tibet, China, Mongolia, Arabia, and Central Asia. So I'll talk about these two a little more as they pop up in the story, but I want to back up and take us right back to the beginning of this story, because most of the church history story that you will have gotten from other sources, including me, has been the story of the other half, the western half of the church going from Antioch over to Greece, over to Rome. That's the part that's actually talked about even in Scripture, because it follows Paul, and that's the direction Paul went. But we know from other traditions that Paul wasn't the only missionary in the first century. In fact, there were many others, and a lot of them went east rather than west. One of the most interesting traditions has to do with another disciple, the disciple Thomas. And there's a very, very early tradition which says that Thomas actually was sent on a commission to take the gospel to India. It's a marvelous story. We don't know 100% if it's true. Most of these stories from the early church beyond the Bible, you can never tell for sure. But there's a lot that goes into Thomas's story that actually suggests it might be true. The story is that after the Jerusalem church got going in the book of Acts, James took over the leadership of it. So the apostles didn't really need to stay around there in Jerusalem all that much more. So they decided to take up the commission that Jesus had given them. Go and preach the gospel to all nations. And the story has them sort of picking straws and figuring out who's going where. And Peter ended up taking the gospel into what's now northern Turkey. That's pretty well attested because that's the people that he writes his letters to in the New Testament. And eventually he ends up in Rome as well. Andrew takes the gospel up into what's now Eastern Europe. Thomas draws the short straw and ends up with India. Thomas really doesn't want to go to India. And so he basically attempts to run away, but he has a vision of Jesus, or Jesus in effect sort of tricks him into having to go. And so Thomas gets on a boat and goes to India and preaches the gospel there. The reason why we believe this is a historically believable tradition is because in that story there are a lot of names of Indian kings and towns that we can go back and look up that actually were there in India. And there's still churches today in India on the west coast, the Malabar coast, which claim descent from Thomas's churches back in the 1st century. I just think that's wonderful and wild that the disciples right off the bat went out and took the mission to the world. One of the other disciples, not one of the 12, but one of the wider group. If you remember in Luke, there's a story where Jesus sends out the 70 or the 72 disciples. And they go off as sort of short-term missionaries and travel around and preach the gospel in Galilee and Palestine and then come back. Well, according to the traditions, one of these guys was named Addai. And he becomes a missionary to the east. I'll tell you another story. This is another story which we're almost certain is not true, but it makes for a good story. That's that the king of Edessa, which is in East Syria, during Jesus' lifetime,
King Egba and his son, known as the Black,
heard about Jesus, and he suffered from a chronic condition, and so he wrote a letter to Jesus saying, I've heard you're a great healer, I believe in you, would you please come up here and heal me of this illness? And Jesus actually writes a letter back to him, which tradition has kept. So if you want to read something Jesus actually wrote, we don't think it's real, but it's there. Someone preserved it. He writes a letter back and says, well, I can't come right now because I'm busy here doing my mission to the Jews, but I'll send along this little icon of me, a little picture of me. That'll heal you. And then after my ministry is done here, I'll send my disciple Addai, and he'll bring the message, the gospel to you. And so we have this story. It's probably made up after the fact, but it's wonderful. And they have this little letter that church tradition kept that was apparently written by Jesus. Anyway, Addai went and preached the gospel to eastern Syria. Again, this part of the tradition is historically believable because they counted as their founder one of the lesser apostles. If you were going to make up a story about who brought the gospel to you, you would choose one of the big names, one of the people that somebody already knew. You would say, oh yeah, it was Paul, it was Peter, John, one of those guys. But no, they've consistently said it was Addai that brought them the gospel. So historians look back and say, you know what, that's probably true. Addai, one of Jesus' 70 followers, went out as a missionary and took the gospel to this kingdom that had never heard it before. So right again from the beginning, Christian religion is a missionary religion. And it doesn't stop there. Over the next couple centuries, other apostles, other missionaries go out from Edessa and they evangelize all the way down into Mesopotamia, into what's now Iraq. And they plant churches in Iraq. They cross over international borders into Persia and they plant churches in Persia. And the faith grows and flourishes and people are excited about it. They believe it. And at this point, there's not much persecution. The Persian Empire is ruled by a group called the Parthians. And the Parthians are kind of like the Romans. They don't really care who you worship, just so long as you are a good citizen. So they let the church do their thing. But that changed in the 200s AD, because the Parthians lost the kingdom and a new group called the Sassanids arose. The Sassanids are a group of Persians from the upper heartlands of Iran. And from time immemorial they had followed a religion called Zoroastrianism. It's a wacky name, and there aren't too many people who still practice it. But it was a tradition that honored fire and honored the earth, and it believed in a strict duality, that there was a God of good and a God of evil, and they were equal in power. They were constantly butting heads. You wanted to be on the good God's side. Well, you could debate the merits of this religion in another forum, but for our purposes, what this meant was that when the Sassanids took over, it was the start of rough times for the Christians. Their religion became outlawed, and they began to suffer tremendously fierce persecution. From there we move into the 4th century, and in the 4th century things get very, very difficult for the church in Persia and Iraq. And the reason why is actually because the Roman Emperor Constantine decided to become a Christian. We in the West look back at that, and I've talked about that story before. We look back at that and say, here's where the church really sort of made it. They've been growing and growing and growing in the Roman Empire. Finally, they get a Roman emperor to adopt the faith, and Christianity is permitted as a legal religion. In fact, in a couple generations, it becomes the official religion. Seems like a good thing, doesn't it? One of the difficult things about church history is that when it gets mixed up in politics, very hard things happen. And this happened back then. The Sassanid Persian Empire was the enemy of Constantine and the Roman Empire. And when Constantine came out and said, I'm a Christian, the Sassanids said, then all Christians are our enemies. And they bloodily put down the church in Persia and in Mesopotamia. Estimates run upwards of 500,000 Christians killed. That is far and away more than any that died under persecutions in the Roman Empire. And we have probably heard stories about Christians dying in the Colosseum. Those things did happen in the Roman Empire, but they were nothing compared to what the Church of the East faced under the Persians. In the 5th century, I'm going to get into some theology here, and this is where that last very heavy, complex historical theology session that you guys sat through, this is where that's going to pay off. Because this is where the Church of the East sort of breaks communion with the other churches. I talked a little bit about how there were rival opinions about the nature of Christ. Was he two distinct persons stuck in one body? Was he a blending of the two in which the God part sort of took over? Or was he somehow both human and God, fully present, but in just one person? That's what the Council of Chalcedon set out to decide. Well, the Church of the East was linked by tradition to Antioch in Syria. And they had been on the side of the debate saying, we want to emphasize both natures, human and divine. We don't want to put up with any of that blending of natures that those Coptic Christians do down there in Egypt. Both natures have to be preserved. And in fact, they often talked about it in two persons rather than just one person, which gets a little weird. But as we talked about last time, the church gets together at Chalcedon and they decide on what's basically a compromise position. In the end, it's not actually that different from what the Church of the East believes. But what stuck in the throat of the Church of the East was that in the process of making these decisions, the Christians from Constantinople and the Christians from Rome and the Christians from Alexandria started talking badly about men of faith that the Church of the East saw as its heroes. Theologians like Theodore of Mopsuestia and Nestorius. These guys were condemned as heretics for a while, even though they were both pretty good theologians. And the Church of the East said, no way. No, we're not part of that. And so they walked out. And the Coptic Church, which we now see in the news in Egypt, the Coptic Church walked out too. Those two churches did not accept the Chalcedonian Creed, which we and the Roman Catholics and the Greek Orthodox and every other denomination we have here, we all accept that creed. These two didn't. And they didn't, not because they believed anything wildly different about the nature of Christ, but because they were offended by the way their Christian brothers and sisters acted. So this is a reminder to us of how fragile a thing church unity can be. Even great teachers and leaders of the faith are still human beings, and they can get their tempers worked up, and they can get mad at each other, and they can walk away. Broken relationships result. So this is where the Church of the East drops away from the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church. The 6th century is when Addai comes around. And in Addai's time, the Persian rulers were really giving the church a run for their money. To the point where they couldn't even select their own leaders unless the Persian emperor said it was okay. So they were having to go and seek out the authority of the state ruler just in order to get their leader. I mean, imagine here in America, if when you were seeking me as a pastor, imagine if you had to consult with the governor of Maine or with the president before you could choose who you wanted to as pastor. There's something a little funny about that, right? The leaders of state shouldn't have a say in who's there to lead the church. But this is what they had to deal with just in order to survive. And there was a while where the emperor said, nope, we're not giving you any patriarchs. You can't select leaders for yourself. Just see if you can last without any leaders to lead you. This is where Addai came along. He was this desert monk. That's why he looks like he's sort of semi-skeletal in the picture. Yeah, he did a lot of fasting, a lot of just living out alone, praying all the time. And suddenly this opportunity came where he was called upon to step into a situation of need with the church. And he stepped up. He went out and he visited all the churches at great personal peril to himself and encouraged them and talked to the local leaders and raised the profile of Christianity in the Persian Empire to the point where it almost came to be respected by the Zoroastrian emperors. The next century is the one where the whole story changes. And it changes because a new religion pops up. That, of course, is Islam. No one up until this time had thought very much about Arabia. Arabia was this backwater place between the Mediterranean world and Persia. And there were Christians who lived down there were Jews who lived down there, and there were a lot of pagan tribes who lived down there. And into the middle of all this religious milieu came a leader named Muhammad, and he believed he was receiving visions from the angel Gabriel, and he wrote them down and started preaching them. Now, one of the things I hope this will inform you about is I'm going to bust up a couple politically correct myths you may have heard about Muslims and Islam in the media. In our day and age, it's very, depending on who you watch, a lot of people are trying to claim credit for Islam for certain things they achieved in their history. One of them, if you talk to any Muslims in particular, they're very proud of the fact that within a generation, this group of nobodies popped out of the desert and conquered the two greatest empires in the world of their day, minus the Chinese. They didn't know about the Chinese. But they conquered Persia, and they took away probably 50 to 60% of the East Roman Empire's lands. They swept through all of Palestine, Syria, North Africa. They completely took over all of Persia. Well, how did they do that? Muslim apologists, defenders of the Muslim faith, will tell you this is a sign that their religion is favored by God. Of course, naturally, that's their prerogative to believe that, if they like. As a historian, I look at it and I see the picture somewhat differently. The truth of the matter is, in the 2 decades leading up to the emergence of Islam, the East Roman Empire and the Persian Empire were in continual war. And it was terrible, taxing war on both sides. The East Roman Empire invaded Persia all the way up to the gates of the capital. And then they were pushed back. And the Persians pushed all the way up, almost to Constantinople itself, until they were pushed back. And both empires were just exhausted. They had lost most of their fighting men. They had lost most of their armament. And it's at this point that the Muslims emerge onto the scene. And not to take anything away from their military acumen, they do win some incredible battles. But it's not as if they're beating the top dogs. They're basically cleaning up the mess, stepping into a power gap that had been left behind by others. Anyway, they come in and suddenly the Church of the East is under Muslim rule. And for us looking back today, we all say, uh-oh, this is problems. At the time, it was actually a good change for them. The Sassanid Persians had been horrible persecutors of the church in the East. And the Muslims, in the very first few centuries, were actually okay with Christians. Much of the Quran told them to respect the people of the book, which referred to Jews and Christians. And so most of the Muslim leaders in that day and age did that. Christians had to take a lower role in society. They were basically second-class citizens, and they had to pay special taxes. But they weren't really persecuted as such, and they were kind of respected. And so that was actually a step up for them at the time. After the first 100 or so years of living under the Muslims, you get the next great figure, who's Timothy. Timothy the First, Timothy the Great. He's the patriarch of the Church of the East. And he moves the seat of their church to Baghdad, the new imperial city. Baghdad was once really the most important and powerful city in the world back in this day. The center of the biggest, greatest empire. And that was where Timothy had his reign from as leader of the church. So he's basically the pope of a church that is far bigger in those days than the Roman Catholic Church was. And Timothy is a wonderful guy, a wonderful story. He has a burning heart for missions. The Muslim leaders told them, you guys can practice your religion, but we don't want you trying to convert people who are already Muslims. And Timothy says, well, we're not going to stop any Muslims who want to become Christians, but if you don't want us actively proselytizing, we'll just go out there and we'll convert the rest of the world. And so that's what he set out to do. He said, well, if we can't send missionaries out here, we'll send them out to China. We'll send them to Tibet. Can you imagine guys in the 700s AD scaling up the Himalayas to bring the gospel to people they had never seen before, people whose language they didn't even speak? This is what they were intent on doing. Timothy also tried to convert the Muslim caliph. The caliph at the time was a man called Harun al-Mahdi, which means, it's kind of a pompous title, it means Aaron the Messiah. And he would sit down in debates with the caliph. The caliph is the Muslim word for the ruler, the emperor. And the caliph would try to stick him on all these different points of theology. He would say, well, you guys believe that God had a son. That God had a son by a woman. Isn't this blasphemy? And the Muslim caliph was thinking, incidentally, as many Muslims do today, that Christians believe that God the Father came down, had sexual intercourse with Mary, and that's how Jesus was conceived. Of course, Christians do not believe that God came down and had a physical act of intercourse with Mary, but that's what the Muslim thought. And so Timothy cleared it up for him, and he cleared it up with this wonderful analogy. I put it on the bottom of the page. He said, Jesus was born from a virgin as man, but from God he was born as light is born of the sun, and as a word is born of the soul. It's just a very beautiful and poetic way of describing how Jesus of Nazareth came to be. The other big issue was the Trinity. And like most Muslims today, the Caliph al-Mahdi was also confused as to what Christians believe. We need to do a better job explaining our theology, because one of the big reasons of misunderstanding between us and the Muslim world is that the way they understand our theology really is blasphemous. That many Muslims believe that we believe in a trinity of God, Jesus, and Mary. That those are the three divine persons that we worship. And to their minds, this is polytheism. They think we believe in three gods. And that's what the Caliph said. He said, how can you believe in three different gods? Scripture teaches plainly that God is one. And Timothy comes up with what I think is one of the best historical analogies for the Trinity. He takes a coin out of his pocket. It's worth 3 denarii. So we have $10 bills or whatever. This is a 3 denarius coin. He says, look, here's something. This is one in its nature. It is one coin. It is golden. One in its nature. But it is 3 in its persons, 3 in its denominations. It is worth 3 denarii. This is like the Trinity. It is not against logic to believe that something can be 1 and 3 at the same time, because we believe that they are not 1 and 3 in the same respect at the same time. And that's what the Trinity is. We believe in 3 persons existing in one Godhead. So Timothy really was one of the leading lights of this great tradition. I'll finish up the story of this church because it gets a little bit more tragic from here on out. They continue growing into the early part of the second millennium. They take the gospel deep into Central Asia. By the time the Mongol hordes come down out of Mongolia, many of Genghis Khan's own family are actually Christians. They've been converted by the Church of the East. Genghis Khan himself was not a Christian, but there were many Christians among his group. Unfortunately, this all didn't last long. And by the way, that picture there, that what looks like sort of a pagoda, that's actually an ancient Church of the East church in China. One of the things that they were really good at was finding culturally appropriate ways to spread the gospel. And Church of the East missionaries came into China, they learned the language, they learned the philosophical terminology, and they told the gospel in that way. And they said, look, we don't have to build churches the way we remember them architecturally. We can build churches that the Chinese people will feel at home in. This is a remarkable missionary sensitivity that won't pop up again until almost the 20th century. Most early Protestant missionaries were actually terrible on things like this. We forced native people to go to churches that looked like our churches and to dress like Western people for almost the first 100 years that we were doing missions. But the Church of the East missionaries had it right. In the 14th century, the Church of the East collapses dramatically. Part of it was the Black Plague, part of it was increasing persecution from Muslims, and part of it was a terrible man from the pages of history whom you might have heard to as Tamerlane. He was a warlord in Central Asia in the 14th century, and he just butchered Christians left and right. And by the end of that century, you just had little pockets that were left. A pocket in what's now sort of northern Iraq, a pocket over in India. And they've held on for the past 500-600 years. Some of them joined in with the Catholic Church. Many of them are still part of their own church community. But here in the 21st century, in this past decade, they've turned a major corner again. because of what's going on in the Middle East today, there is increasing persecution of native Christians. Many of them are having to leave their homes. Many of them are having to come to America or to Europe or other places. And this is one of the things I'm going to talk about, is that unintentionally by us, some of these things have come to happen to the Church of the East, just like they did in Constantinople's day, Constantine's day. It seems like a good thing for Constantine to become a Christian, for the Roman Empire to become Christian, but it was a terrible thing for the Church of the East in terms of the persecution they face.
We, the Ministry of the Real Truth, hope that you've enjoyed this roughly 30 minutes of the history of the Assyrian Church of the East. If you did, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, add your comments below this video, and share this with all your family, friends and others. It is important to know this history because this is of the original Church of the East, founded by Thomas, Addai, with the help of Bartholomew and Peter, around the 1st century AD. And the persecutions, the massacres, the martyrdom, etc. that this church went through over the centuries. But they kept to the traditions, the teachings of what Peter, Thomas and Addai, Bartholomew taught them over those centuries of hell. So, as we stated, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, add your comments underneath this video, and then share this with all the people you know, your family, your friends, neighbours, strangers, etc. So that they all come to realise, hey, this church was the most persecuted, and they kept to their rights, their traditions and their scriptures handed to them by Thomas, Martyr Thomas, the disciple of Christ, etc. And we, the Ministry of the Real Truth, are bringing you the translations of the Galilean Aramaic manuscripts, hidden and therefore preserved by the Assyrian Church of the East, the Apostolic Church of the East, for over 2,000 years. They hid them from the Roman Emperor Constantine and the Roman Catholic Church. He was a declared Christian, but he also was a pagan. He mixed the two. Look at the timeline history by that Jovovich guy, and he verifies this fact along with a lady, a qualified lady. When they look at the Constantine's Archer of Triumph, etc., find that video on YouTube and watch it and learn from that. Okay, join us for part 2 of this audio, Heroes of the Faith, the Church of the East. We are quite sure that you will enjoy part 2 as we have enjoyed part 1 and bringing you part 1.